Welcome into another edition of the Gamecock Central Radio Podcast. I'm Wes Mitchell, alongside Chris Clark, as we sort of get into week 2 of South Carolina's preseason fall football camp, Chris. And I thought that the first week, for the most part, sort of, went about as expected. Maybe a few surprises here or there on guys sort of stepping up. Maybe the expectations for certain guys go a little bit up, a little bit down, and we'll see how that sort of continues. They didn't put the pads on until, Friday, I guess, so you don't really know a whole lot in those first 3-4 days of camp, but I guess so far so good for South Carolina. Haven't had that sort of really bad injury or anything like that at this point, so I guess first of all, man, and by the way, if you're joining us, we're going to talk mostly fall camp, mostly football, might delve into a little recruiting, but for the most part, the focus right now is on football, so that's what we're going to hit. Any just sort of first impressions for you, or even surprises, or anything that just the opposite of that went exactly the way you expected in week 1, Chris?
It's been sort of tough to get a full gauge on. We can see some things, we can hear some things, but we got to keep in mind, I mean, we haven't seen, full team 11 on 11, go, a lot of that stuff. And we will at some point this preseason, I'm sure, but we've been pretty limited in what we've actually seen. And so I don't think there are a lot of, surprises from that standpoint. I think what we have seen is, again, I go back to just being able to see how some guys look physically, sort of assess the team speed, assess the depth situation. And so I have been surprised, by how a couple of the guys look just in terms of body composition and things like that. For example, I mean, one that you've been harping on, Wes, is Dennis Wanham, DJ Wanham. Just watching him, again, it's just in drills, and, we've seen some Oklahoma drill and things like that. But he's a really physically impressive kid. I remember you remarked to me in practice that he sort of looked in pads like Marquavius Lewis did last season as a senior. Mm-hmm. And DJ's a sophomore, a guy who played last season. And I've been impressed with him because he really looks really technically sound. He's got good hands. He's a smart player. Does he have the, first step explosiveness of, a guy who you could look at as a freshman or sophomore and say, well, this guy's got, first round pick. He's just so twitched up. Not really, but he is an athletic guy. And I remember Lance Thompson last year said, he was asked about DJ Wanham early in camp, and he said, this guy, he's got the mind of a senior. He's a very smart kid. And remember, this is a guy that Will Muschamp really liked during recruiting. He was committed to Indiana. I mean, he didn't have a lot of traction in recruiting, and here we are now. He played as a true freshman. He's 255, and he's going to play a whole lot this season. Just looking at him and then looking at a guy like Brad Johnson, who's a freshman, and he's apparently around the same weight and looks about half the size. So, I mean, that sort of tells you Brad Johnson's growth potential. But that was just one that came to mind, was just getting a look at DJ Wanham and how he's progressed and how much of I think a step forward he may be able to take this season in more of a featured role.
Yeah, and like you said, very technically sound. I feel like there's I've kind of struggled to find the best way to say it, but it's almost with Wanham, it's like there's no wasted motion, if that makes any sense. Like,
sure.
When he does sled drills, his hands are so violent, but it's also like he knows exactly sort of that the idea of the shortest distance from 2 points is a straight line. Like he knows exactly where to place his hands, and there's a quickness and a violentness in getting his hands to the proper place. So he's very deliberate, and that's not to say he's stiff, which is kind of the connotation there, but he's very deliberate in that he seems to know where his hands should be. He seems to know how to lean like he's supposed to, and that can go a long way. I think when you start to look at the big questions for this team, that Buck position was a really big question mark going in, and I don't know if you can truly say any question is answered in 1 week, a little over a week of practice. But I think if you start to look at the progress of DJ Wanham, you look at, like you said, Brad Johnson, who's going to play some there. And then I think the guy that really makes you feel a little bit better about that position is that Bryson Allen Williams just brings this versatility to linebacker and to the Buck, where we've seen him get a lot of work, at least early in practice, with the Buck position. So, I think you start to feel a little bit better about that spot, whereas before, you look and you say, wow, lose Darius English. You've got one guy there that's really played any meaningful snaps, being Wanham, and that was as a true freshman last year. It's a big question mark. So I think at the very least, as far as having guys that can help there, having a little bit of depth, you start to just feel a little bit better about that position. Now, of course, we're going to find out during the season, how do they match up against the opponents? How do they match up against other, SEC offensive tackles, stuff like that, trying to get off the edge? That's something we still won't know. But I think as far as just having guys that give you a chance, at the very least, I think you start to feel a little bit better maybe about that Buck position.
Right. And, I think it's, there was and we might hit on this later. I have a feeling we're going to hit on it later towards the end. But, going into the 2014 season, there were some questions about South Carolina's defense from a pass rush perspective, given what they lost. And
that is a perfect tease for later on, I think.
Right. And so there were questions, but, I don't think many folks anticipated, the train wreck that it was at times that season. Okay. And so I feel like some people are, and look, the pass rush is a legitimate concern. And when you talk about pass rush, it, for a defense that, was very opportunistic in terms of turnovers, that's one reason why they were able to keep themselves in some games, even win some games last season's turnovers. They've got to do better just at getting off the field, period, forcing some punts this season. But pass rush is a big part of that. And some people are almost they're going a little bit too extreme, I feel like, where, don't feel like there's anybody that is even capable of rushing the passer on the roster. It's a big concern until it's addressed. But I think just from what I've gained, just hearing some things, I feel like in the short term and in the longer term that the staff feels not great by any means, because there's not a Clowney, there's not a first-round pick on this roster in terms of, pass rusher at this point. But there's some guys they feel like can do the job, and be serviceable, and then some guys who have a chance to be really good. Because some of their play, Bryson Allen Williams, he'll help there with the pass rush some. They'll put him in some situations, but he's also a senior. So you look at, well, who can help them now, and then who can help them later? Well, Wanham's still a sophomore. Kier Thomas is better suited to play outside, which he will this season. Aaron Sterling and Brad Johnson have the look of a couple guys that can help. It won't, they're still freshmen, so you can't expect too much, but they'll be able to help some there. So they have some guys. I don't think it's as dire as, in looking back at 2014, they just didn't have any guys that could get it done, really. I don't think it's that dire, but it is a question. And so, this staff, they got a lot of experience doing it. They still need to continue to upgrade the roster from a personnel standpoint, but I think Mike Peterson did a really good job with Darius English last year. I think that'll continue with that Buck position. I think they've got a little bit more flexibility when you talk about those guys, and that I just mentioned, and Dante Sawyer on the outside, who, look, again, probably not going to have a 12, 13 sack guy on the roster, but if they can piece it together and be better than they were last season to sort of take some of the pressure off the secondary, help out on third down, that would be huge for this team, I think.
Yeah, and I think Mike P, a rising star in the coaching industry, a lot of people very high on that guy. So it'll be fun to see what he can do with that young talent at that position, and as they sort of try to put it all together. I think another guy, to me, the most consistently mentioned, and everybody always wants to hear about and talk about newcomers, but I think the talk of the first week, and it even carried over into Travaris Robinson, on the defensive side when he spoke, had to be Shi Smith. I think this is a guy that we all knew was very, very good, very talented, had a chance to. I think with Shy, you felt like as long as he, took care of business, didn't really face any major injuries or something like that from an athlete standpoint, you always sort of felt like watching Shy in high school. Okay, this guy's going to contribute in some way at the college level. Like, he just has that look about him. He has that ability about him. But I don't know that I thought Shy would sort of be the talk of camp, which I think to this point he absolutely has been in a lot of ways, and it has been impressive. That seems to have continued over to the pads going on, which sometimes, these sort of slot types are very, very impressive before the pads go on, and then it sort of wanes a little bit when the pads go on because that quickness is negated a little bit. But, so far as Shy Smith goes, as far as this offense goes, I think we all knew there was some depth at receiver. We all knew there was some depth, obviously, at tight end and running back. But to me, Shy Smith has sort of been your most talked about guy, especially of the newcomers during this first sort of week plus, Chris.
Yeah, and it's a good point that, you have to be careful when you're projecting skill position guys even, because, once you get to the season and you've got 11-on-11 ball out there under the lights, I mean, it's different even than summer player run practices. It's different than one-on-ones in practice. I mean, the space closes up. It's just everything's a lot tougher for these guys, and they're going to face off against some, when he trots out there, he'll be playing against some guys who can also play. They're on scholarship. They're really good too. But we did hear a lot, consistently, like you said, a lot of good returns on Shy over the summer in terms of just guys. Guys just couldn't cover him in the summer when they were out there working out, and that's sort of carried over into practice too. For me, the question is, okay, how much is he going to play? What are they going to do with him? Because athletically, he's good enough to where, Kurt Roper's got a lot of short passing game concepts. Roper's philosophy in an ideal world is get the ball to your playmakers, get it to them in space, let them run after the catch, let them do things. Don't make it too complicated in that regard. So, Shy Smith's the type of guy where he's fast, but he's also tough in the open field. He's quick. He's a good route runner. He can step and go. And he's sort of like Deebo Samuel in that regard. He becomes a little bit of a running back after the catch. And so I think he'll continue to get bigger and better. For me, it's just how much can he do? How will he fit into the rotation? Because, as a freshman, you're still having to learn the passing game concepts, but he's athletically good enough to where they can plug him in and let him even do some certain things, even on a limited basis. And I'll be curious to see how he fits in on special teams too, because, he's another guy that you'd like to get the ball in his hands if at all possible. And if they trust him in the return game to take care of the football, that'll be a big aspect of it. And you're talking about plugging in a freshman to do it in that case. I think he could make some noise there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Punt return, kick return, I think those are all spots that he's going to have a real shot to get into the game. I think moving forward, there's a lot of position battles that are going to be worth keeping an eye on. You look at the secondary, and I think that's a position that you do get asked about a decent amount, but there's so many moving parts in the secondary that it's kind of just about finding the top five, because they'll be in nickel a lot, and then sort of everything else sort of falls into place behind that. I feel like who's going to start where is an easy question to ask, but it's a hard question to answer just because it's going to depend on, does a Keyshawn Nixon get to the point mentally where he's ready to go ahead and play as a guy that got here a little bit later than everybody else? Is Jamias Williams more of a second teamer this year, or does he go ahead and step in at that nickel spot? Does Chris Lamons play nickel, corner, or safety? He's someone who can play pretty much any spot. So I think Lamons is going to be on the field, certainly somewhere, but who the other starters are, you imagine Jamarcus King is on the field. You imagine Rashad Fenton is on the field. With a solid spring behind him, it seems like DJ Smith is going to have a spot on the field. So those other spots are kind of going to depend on what puts the best five on the field. So that'll be intriguing to watch. I think starting linebacker, obviously, that, those positions are pretty much already locked up. It's more about depth there. But the big position that I think also could sort of maybe have an effect on other positions, Chris, has to be left tackle. And, we haven't heard from Eric Wolford yet. He's going to speak to the media at some point. It's not this week. We haven't talked to him, as far as since fall has started, and to see where his head is at. But one thing I think we all know about Eric Wolford is that he is going to try every single possibility to try and get his best 5 on the field. He's not one of these, hey, we're going to go with these 5 and stick with it. He's going to try everybody everywhere if he has to. So that's a position, from everything I've heard, there's been moving parts at left tackle. There's several guys that have a chance, but all 3 of them sort of have things that concern you as well. So I think left tackle moving forward is probably going to be one of those most watched position battles that's going to affect other positions on the line as well.
Yeah, and Wolford, as we know from his first stint at Carolina, as you said, Wes, he won't hesitate to rotate guys around. They've got to fix, that's the position they've really got to solve. And when we say they've got to solve left tackle, I don't want anybody to take that to mean, well, everything else is set, they feel great about it. That's not the case, but that's a position that's really, really important for them. And so they've already, they made some moves in terms of, kicking Bailey out to right tackle this spring, and that's a move that could stick. But, even when they got past spring ball and in the midst of spring ball, it wasn't like the staff felt entirely comfortable with everything. I mean, there's still recognition that, gotta fix that left tackle position, gotta get some stability, gotta create some more competition at the guard spots. There's a couple guys they gotta continue to motivate with Summer around the corner in terms of getting them to hit some goals in the weight room, things like that. And so, they stayed over in May. A lot of the guys, put in some extra work. They were able to hit some goals in terms of losing weight, gain some muscle. Some of the guys have sort of stepped up and accepted those responsibilities. You look at a Donnell Stanley, and he's someone that's been a good worker for them, but he just unfortunately got injured on the first play of the game last season, and then played a few more snaps, and then that was it. I mean, and for someone who really wanted to get on the field, that was tough. But, he's 315 pounds or so now, which is where they want him. And that gives them, you can feel better about that. Then you got a Blake Camper who missed a lot of the season last year. You got Cedarius Hutcherson, who's young, Dennis Daly, Malik Young. So they've got some guys they can plug in at left tackle, and I think that's one of the main storylines to watch is are they going to permanently move anybody around? Because they're doing some shuffling, they're doing some experimenting, as you said, Wes. But they've got to figure out, okay, at some point, where are we going with this and what are we going to roll with, and then just try to make it as good as you can after that.
And no just cupcake to start the year is the other part of that. I mean, you got this NC State defensive line. Truly, I don't think, off season you hear a lot of hyperbole, which is another tease for later on. There's a lot of hyperbole, but I don't think that this hype for this NC State defensive line is overhype. I think that it is truly, you look at, obviously, Clemson, then you look at NC State. That's 2 of the best defensive lines I think South Carolina is going to face this year. So this line, and you know what? I do wonder how much does that play into your thought process heading into week 1. Maybe the guy, Chris, that is the best player at left tackle or the best 5 week 1 is not necessarily the same answer for week 5. I think a guy like Dennis Daly, has some ability to him, the junior college transfer. Maybe as the year goes on, he gets a chance to make more and more noise, but maybe week 1, you feel like you almost have to go to a guy that's got a little bit more experience. And I'm not saying that's necessarily the case. I'm just saying if everything's sort of equal going in, I think you're going to sort of err towards experience, whereas as the year goes on, like we said, other guys are going to get their chance if that line doesn't look good. And, Wolford's even a guy that even if the team as a whole has played well, if he thinks he can upgrade a spot, he'll give a guy a chance, as the year goes on. He's one of those guys that you have to keep earning your spot every single week in practice. So I think that's going to be one of the more. I remember his first year here. There were different lineups out there very, very often, it seemed like.
Oh yeah. I mean, I can't remember what it was. I mean, we went through at one point in the off season and sort of looked at all the different game lineups from that season he was in Columbia, and I mean there were several different starting lineups, or if the lineup was the same one week, sometimes he shifted it during the game. It just, he didn't hesitate to pull guys, and there are some similarities in him returning to Columbia this time around, and when he got to Columbia for the 2009 season, and that it was a situation in which you looked at the line the previous season and said, it needs to be fixed because it's not, good enough. And in fairness, for example, like the 2008 South Carolina offense wasn't all the offensive line, and last season it wasn't all the offensive line either. But nobody could take an objective look at the O-line and say, okay, it's in great shape going forward. And so they've got to improve some things on the current roster, and they've got to recruit, and that's how really you fix any position in which you feel you're not as good as you need to be. So, they'll continue to do that. I think it'll be really interesting to watch the moves and see what they do going forward.
Absolutely, and all right, so that's pretty much, I think, a good recap of Week 1. Heading into Week 2, like I said, I think we get Lance Thompson one day. We get, Brian McClendon the other day this week. So it'll be interesting to hear from those guys about some of those position battles that are going on at their respective positions. Recruiting, I feel like right now, Chris, recruiting, I should say, is always going on. It never truly stops, but a good portion of the focus sort of turns to football and to fall camp and to getting everything ready there, while there's sort of just on the side, you have to keep talking to guys, you have to stay in touch with guys, and I feel like it does help that these high school kids they're starting their camp as well. They're getting ready for their season, so their focus is on football versus getting blown up on Twitter and texts every single day. But I think you do have to focus on, obviously the guys that are getting close to decisions, and we won't spoil it all for our awesome subscribers who make everything possible by giving everything away. But I would say worth mentioning that two guys in a J.C. Horn and a Josh Van are two guys that we're tracking a little bit extra close right now, just because those two guys have been sort of, I would say, trying to close in on a decision for some time now.
Yeah, and JC originally with the original plan of deciding on July 15th, and then Tennessee came back in and sort of muddied the waters, and so it's really gone back and forth between Alabama, South Carolina, Tennessee. I mean, he's been close to really each of those have led. I mean, each of those have been in pole position at one time or another, and I think the indications are he'll visit South Carolina again. We actually have an interview with him, on our front page that our subscribers can check out, but where he sort of goes in more depth on that. But certainly he's a guy that after the recruiting dead period ends during the season, you take another visit and, expected to render a decision during this season. And Josh Van has been, really for quite some time hoping to make a decision before his senior campaign gets underway, and a guy that South Carolina's been battling Georgia for and has had a really good shot with. So a lot of South Carolina's major targets, going to be waiting until later, sometimes much later in the process, and we won't know anything until December, January, February. But those are a couple guys who are major targets who are moving closer and closer, as you said.
Major targets and major offer lists for a lot of these guys too. Everybody, especially I think people, Chris, that follow it a little bit more on the sort of outside, maybe don't delve into every little thing that happens in recruiting, or saying where's the 4-star guys, where's the highly recruited guys, and you look at Josh Van, you look at J.C. Horn. You look in the future at a Dylan Wanham, who, we spent a good portion talking about his older brother, DJ Wanham. You look at some of these guys, Channing Tindall right down the road at Spring Valley, someone who I'm looking forward to hopefully getting to see this year in person because he's absolutely blown up since this time last year. The highly recruited guys, it just so happens are the ones that have sort of decided to wait a little bit longer to make their decision. So that'll be fun to track during the season. Of course, South Carolina will be looking at getting a lot of those guys on campus for games as they start their home slate. Let's see. As we get ready to close it out, we sort of teased this a little bit earlier. It's something that's, I think, generated a pretty good bit of discussion. I heard WG and Tim Hill talking about it on 107.5 Monday morning as well. But these comments, Chris, from and you mentioned earlier, these comments from Lorenzo Ward. You mentioned earlier that the 2014 preseason slate, Ward sort of talking about, this defense, I believe, Chris, he went as far as to say could be better than the one before.
That's my recollection. Mm-hmm.
Right. Of course, that would be 2014 would be a year that South Carolina did not have Jadeveon Clowney on the field for them. So Whammy has been sort of creating a little bit of, turmoil maybe in Gamecock Nation about his comments when he said that his two pass rushers, James Hearns and Trayvon Young, were better pass rushers as a combination than Jadeveon Clowney and Devin Taylor. Now, I will say, first of all, Whammy does, Chris, like to, at times, exaggerate. So not really a huge surprise in that way. But, I think also worth pointing out that he said the combination of these two was better than the combination of Clowney and Taylor. And he did go on to say that he does not think either one of those guys is as good as Jadeveon Clowney singularly. So I think some of this is a little bit of, oh my God, did you see that headline? I can't believe he said that. And then the rest of this is just Lorenzo Ward being Lorenzo Ward. He's a guy that's always sort of hyped his guys, and he's been a guy that's always, the other side of that, he has always showed confidence in his guys, dating back to his time in Columbia.
Sure. Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, it's still talking season. So people are going to come out and say what they say, and obviously some fans, I'm surprised, we have a thread about it on our message board right now. I'm surprised that more people haven't sort of made that connection with the preseason 2014 comments, or maybe somebody has. If not, it'll be up there soon, I'm sure. sort of linking the 2014 comments and saying, okay, well, how much stock can you put in this? But look, I mean, those two guys are good players. There's no doubt. But I don't really anticipate, you wouldn't really expect a lot different. I mean, you're going to have a guy who, I don't know the context of the question. If somebody asked him, that question straight up, or if he just pulled it out of thin air in terms of, hey, I'm going to make this point because I think those two guys are better. Jadeveon Clowney was a guy that, I mean, you had to know where he was every single play. You changed your game plan, because of him. And you probably do that with Hearns and Young to a degree. Of course, you want to know where those guys are and scheme against them, and they are dangerous pass rushers in that type of defense, especially that they've run. And of course, they'll be changing things up this season. But I can't really. I think Jadeveon Clowney, he's almost equal to more than one player, not just because of how good he was individually, but just because of how much he made you, really change what you wanted to do on offense. I mean, you may say, okay, I'd like to attack this way, but I can't because of Clowney, or I have to use a tight end to chip or a back to chip. There are just a lot of different things that you have to do. You want to run zone read, to his side, he may tackle both guys. I mean, we saw that in games before. So, And Devin Taylor was, I mean, look, he was a good player too. He's a guy that plays in the league right now. It's not like he put up absolutely phenomenal numbers, but he was a really good player. Now, part of the product of that, to be fair, is the guys around him were really good too, but you could say that about a lot of players. I mean, everybody on that Clemson defensive line last season was better because of the guys they were playing with. Everybody on Alabama's defense line and their defense in general was better because of the guys around them. And it was the same way with those Gamecock defenses. That secondary, they were better because of the pass rush and vice versa. So, I don't think it's personally something that people need to absolutely go nuts about. I can see both sides of it.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. No, you're right. And, every great defense is going to have a bunch of good players around them.
Sure.
And Devin's actually, I didn't realize this, Devin's top 10 all-time at South Carolina in career sacks. And which I always, WG made this point this morning, I always thought Devin of being more sort of your all-around, technically sound defensive end, huge just wingspan where he could sort of disrupt things and get his hands up, and it was hard to get around if you were a running back because he could reach out and misdirect you almost. And hey, the guy's going into his 5th year in the NFL, so that says something. There's been a lot of really good football players that didn't stick in the NFL for a 5th year, and also the guy's like 6'8", 270 pounds now. So,
yeah.
But then you throw in the fact that, I mean, this South Carolina team at that point, they were putting, they were rolling Melvin Ingram out there at different spots on the field as well. Chaz Sutton was sort of a guy that never did huge things as a starter, but was a very quality backup for South Carolina. So those guys were able to rest at times as well when they needed it. So that all those, let's be honest, all those guys sort of fed off of each other. But that, like you said, I think the words you said, talking season, that's still very much true. It's still talking season for at least a few more weeks, and then we'll find out. But hey, it makes for good discussion. I'll give Whammy that. It makes for very, very good discussion. So anyway, we'll probably do this again. What do you say, Chris? Maybe later this week after we get a little more from the coaches this week, and then of course first scrimmage is Saturday, right? We obviously won't have full access to that, but first scrimmage always, to me, you sort of mark camp down as okay. Camp starts, there's sort of a marking point. Pads go on, that's sort of a point. And then first scrimmage, that's when guys really start to either earn positions or lose positions. So I think everything starts to come a little bit more in focus, Chris, when you get that first scrimmage.
For sure. I mean, that's their opportunity to put them out there and see how they respond. And again, there's always, especially when you're talking about, we touched on this last time, special teams, and guys can do one thing in practice and maybe not necessarily do it in games, but scrimmage is going to be the best approximation of that. I mean, just when you're looking at how guys are playing along the lines of scrimmage, are they getting open? Are they making the right decisions? Are their reads and their keys on defense correct? That's going to be the best opportunity for the coaching staff to assess it, because that's the closest they can get to a game situation. And so, the one-on-ones, the drills, all those things are great. The summer workouts, set the tone. They set the table for all that, and it's so important. But at the end of the day, it's about going out there and doing the job, and so that'll give them a chance to be able to see what these guys can do in that type of setting. I think there could be some surprises. I think a lot of the commodities that are known. I don't think they'll scrimmage a lot of the bigger names. They may make some of it about some of the younger guys and creating some more competition, but there are a lot of areas in which guys that are even penciled into starting jobs or even sort of locked into starting jobs, they've still got to get a lot better too. And so it'll serve several purposes for them on Saturday.
Absolutely. And before we go, I do want to mention Chris, one of our prime sponsors who help make the site possible. That is Hyatt Place Harbison. Very excited again to partner up with them to offer a special game weekend rate of $124 a night, I should say. $124 a night plus tax at Hyatt Place Harbison. Obviously, a lot of different hotels. The demand at a hotel is going to determine your price. So most places in Columbia, South Carolina, on a game day weekend, you're gonna pay a pretty penny to stay. So very, very excited to once again team up with Hyatt Place Harbison and Adam Miller over there. They do a great job, and this is a perk that we brought our members last year and are excited to bring to them again. That's Hyatt Place Harbison, and you can lock in that special rate on the Insider Forum by looking at the top and clicking through with that link. That's Hyatt Place Harbison, one of our prime sponsors on Gamecock Central. Chris, enjoyed it as always, man. We'll do it later this week. For Chris Clark, I'm Wes Mitchell, Gamecock Central Radio Podcast. We'll talk to you later.